Good day, everyone, and thank you for joining me today. My name is Dr. Renuka Thakore, and I am the founder of Global Sustainable Futures Network. I'm based in UK. It's a great pleasure to speak with you today on the topic that is deeply personal to me, but also globally significant: the intersection of climate change, traditional communities, and justice in the southwestern Amazonia, with a specific focus on Rondônia, Brazil. This presentation seeks to draw meaningful connections between the local struggles faced by the indigenous and Quilombola communities in this ecological rich yet vulnerable region, and the broader framework of international relationship, global governance, inequality, and human rights. Through this lens, we will explore not only the devastating impacts of environmental degradation and climate change, but also how systems of power, justice, and global cooperation must evolve to support those much affected ones that demands both urgency and empathy, and most of all, action rooted in justice and inclusion. So in this presentation, I will walk you through three interconnected dimensions that are essential to understanding the climate crisis in southwestern Amazon: international relations and global governance, inequality and social justice, and human rights and social rights. Firstly, from the perspective of international relation and global governance, climate change is not just a local or national issue. It is a global crisis that requires coordinated international efforts. The Amazon, often called as the lungs of the planet, is critical to global climate stability. Yet, governance structures remain fragmented, while those in support for conservation, equality, and extractivism and deforestation is happening. Secondly, the crisis depends existing inequality and social injustice. Traditional and indigenous communities in Rondonia are disproportionately impacted. They contribute least to the global emissions, yet suffer the most worst effects. Many lack access to basic services like legal land rights and adaptation resources. Climate impacts exacerbate poverty, displacement, and marginalization, widening the gap between urban centers and rural or forest-dependent populations. Finally, this leads us to the lens of human rights and social justice. Environmental degradation is a direct human rights issue. The right to clean water, food, health, and safe environment are all threatened. These dimensions compel us to reframe from Amazon crisis not just as a matter of environmental science, but a critical challenge for global injustice diplomacy. Rondônia is a state in southwestern Amazonia region of Brazil, and it has immense ecological and cultural significance. It is one of the most one of the most diverse areas on Earth, and rich in tropical rainforest, rivers, and wildlife. But beyond its natural environment, Rondonia is also home of vibrant indigenous and Quilomba communities, traditional groups whose culture and livelihood are deeply intertwined with the land and ecosystem. However, this region is undergoing rapid environmental and socio-economical transformation. Deforestation, illegal mining, land grabbing, wildfires, and shifting agriculture practices are threatening both the biodiversity and the way of life of these communities. And these all are particularly important what is happening in Rondonia and is what is representing globally. Local realities intersect with larger issues of international relation, inequality, and human rights. In the southwestern Amazonia, particularly Rondonia, Brazil, we are witnessing rapid environmental and social economical changes while devastating climate impacts. Deforestation from agriculture, cattle ranching, and extractive industries is destroying long-standing ecosystems and accelerating land use change. The region faces intensifying climate stress, frequent floods, droughts, wildfires, and extreme heat, threatening local resilience. These shifts are hitting traditional and indigenous communities hardest. Agriculture is becoming less reliable, food security is weakening, water access is fragile, and biodiversity is stiff decline. This isn't just environmental damage, it's about loss of livelihoods, cultural erosion, and deepening inequality for those most connected to the land. So let us dwell into international relations and global governance. Amazons play a critical role in global environmental governance. Known as lungs of planets, the Amazon serves a massive carbon sink, vital for regulating global climate and supporting frameworks like Paris Agreement, the UNFCCC, and SDG 13 on climate action. However, deforestation is threatening this function, turning the Amazon from a carbon sink into a carbon source, accelerating global climate breakdown. These impacts are transboundary, influencing weather patterns and ecosystems far beyond Brazil's border. Protecting the Amazon requires inclusive and cooperative global governance. It's not just a regional concern, it is shared global responsibility. Brazil holds a complex but vital role in global environmental politics, characterized by both leadership and contradiction. It has ratified the Paris Agreement, actively engages in COPs, and often represents the Global South in climate negotiations. International support and aid also flow into Brazil for Amazon preservation and sustainable development. Yet, there's tension between these global communities and domestic actions. Agriculture expansion and resource extraction in forested areas often conflict with Brazil's environmental pledges. This leads to an ongoing debate. Brazil depends in sovereignty over the Amazon, while the forest global ecological important calls for shared responsibility, balancing national development with global climate obligations remains a major challenge that will shape the path of climate justice and governance. Structural inequalities and justice are deep-rooted and systemic, and unfortunately, they are increasing globally. So despite numerous frameworks and declarations and international efforts to address them, we have not been able to achieve these solutions to address inequalities. And so let us examine these issues in the Amazonia. The Amazon region, while ecologically vital, has long been shaped by structural inequalities, especially for indigenous and quilombola communities. Historically marginalized, these groups have faced exclusion from political, economical, and social systems with limited recognition and their land rights and cultural heritage. Basic services like healthcare, education, clean water, and energy remains largely inaccessible, especially in remote areas, while poor infrastructure. This depends their vulnerability to environmental and social crises. A key injustice is environmental racism, where indigenous communities disproportionately suffer from the impacts of deforestation, land grabbing, and pollution, often from unregulated industrial activity. These inequalities are rooted in colonial exploitation and persist due to the weak policy response and lack of representation. This ongoing cycle of exclusion hinders their ability to protect both their livelihoods and the ecosystems they depend on. Climate injustice is a lived reality for many vulnerable communities, especially in the Amazon. Those who contribute least to the climate change often bear the heaviest burdens through displacement, loss of culture, and exclusion from decision making. Indigenous and Quilomba communities are frequently uprooted by deforestation, land grabs, and development projects, often without consent or adequate support. Relocations are poorly planned, lacking resources and infrastructure. Adaptation resources such as funding, technology, infrastructure are unequally distributed, favoring only wealthy nations and urban centers, while rural and marginal communities are left behind. Testimonials from such local leaders and community members must be highlighted, and they highlight daily struggle to survive and protect their way of life amidst escalating climate threats. These voices must guide policies centered on equity, restorative justice, and community led solutions to ensure that no one is left behind. And lastly, we will examine human rights and social justice. So, as the climate change intensifies, it threatens fundamental human rights, especially for indigenous and Quilomba communities in the Amazonia. Their right to land is at risk due to deforestation and land grabbing, undermining food security, cultural identity, and livelihoods. Access to clean water is also being disturbed by shifting rainfall patterns. Floods and droughts are becoming frequent. They are jeopardizing health and traditional farming. These aren't just environmental losses. They strike at the heart of these communities, the way they live and their life, especially their living resources. Cultural rights are equally threatened as the destruction of sacred forests and rivers leads to the erosion of ancestral knowledge and identity. Meanwhile, violence against indigenous leaders and environmental defenders continues to rise as they resist exploitation and advocate for their rights. This is not just an environmental issue, it is a human rights crisis. Responding to it requires global solidarity and urgent protection for the people most affected by climate change. So, to address human rights violations against indigenous communities, international legal frameworks are essential. The UN Declaration on Rights of Indigenous People, UNDRIP, affirms rights to land, culture, and free prior and informed consent. However, implementation remains weak, with governments like Brazil often failing to uphold these protections, resulting in land loss and targeting of environmental defenders. The Inter-American Court of Human Rights, IACTR, has set powerful precedents, such as Saramaka versus Suriname, affirming indigenous land and consultation rights. Still, enforcement is inconsistent, especially where national governments resist compliance. Meanwhile, there's a growing advocacy for ecocide to be recognized as an international crime, including ecocide in the Rome Statute would hold states and corporations accountable for large-scale environmental harm, and especially where it impacts vulnerable communities like indigenous people. This could mark a major step forward in protecting both human rights and environment. So, to achieve justice and resilience for indigenous communities in the Amazon, we must focus on actionable solutions. We must empower these communities by giving them education, providing them technological know-how, and as well as connecting them to the industries or investors or other communities, or bringing researchers to how understand them, how to address this climate change and environmental degradation. It is not necessary that we bring a new knowledge because they are knowledgeable about their local issues. We must take them on the round table and discussion table to understand what are the things that they need and what are the solutions they need for us to provide them. It is very crucial and critical that we recognize the land rights. First of all, that is very, very important. We must secure land tenure and allow communities to protect their resources, culture, and traditional way of life, providing a legal foundation to fight against exploitation and reforestation. We must integrate community-led land management. There is a very good example in Nepal where they have addressed forest management by community-led forest management. And we should take these examples of national systems which has worked for other nations and expose them to the other contexts where it might be possible to have an essential system for legal empowerment. There's also a pressing need for climate finance that directly supports indigenous communities. Current mechanisms often overlook their unique need. Funding must prioritize projects that respect traditional knowledge and support community-driven solutions, such as sustainable agriculture, reforestation, and fishery. This allows indigenous people not just to adapt, but to proactively mitigate climate change. Equally important is the inclusion of traditional indigenous knowledge and communities that has been developed through the centuries of expertise in sustainable land and resource management, which can provide practical, culturally relevant solutions. By integrating this knowledge into climate and biodiversity policies, we can create more effective and inclusive environmental strategies. In conclusion, empowering indigenous communities through land rights, targeted climate finance, and the inclusion of their knowledge will build resilience and drive sustainable development. We must listen to their voices and work together for a just and equitable future for all. And so let me just conclude with three critical points that Amazon has a global impact, and therefore it is vital for us to address its biodiversity and cultural heritage. The deforestation and degradation affect the entire planet, and therefore we must stop the rising emission and disturbing rainfall forests in Amazon, and we must be protecting it as our global responsibility. We must have inclusion governance, which would provide solutions that are collaborative and inclusive. Indigenous and traditional communities must be central in shaping policies, as their knowledge and experiences are crucial for sustainable solutions. True governance must respect sovereignty while promoting shared responsibilities. And finally, climate action must prioritize social justice and human rights. We must address historical inequalities and ensure fair access to resources and decision making for marginalized communities. We must move forward. Let's connect and commit for justice, inclusion, and sustainability, because the fight for climate resilience is also the fight for dignity, equality, and human rights. So I thank you and for listening to me, and together we will make this happen. Thank you very much.